Welcome back. At this point, you've likely progressed through Part 2 of Module 4, looking at the physical arrangement of your classroom as well as the routines that you have established in your school and in your classroom each and every day. At this point, we'll be transitioning into Part 3 of Module 4, where we will continue to look at and emphasize antecedent and instructional strategies around behavior in your classroom. In Part 3, we'll be looking to answer the question, how do I define and teach expectations for my students? So back to our leading question, are the foundations of effective, positive classroom behavior support in place? In Part 2, we did identify and walk through the first two elements of physical layout of your learning environment, as well as the predictable routines. Within this part of the module, we'll be looking at how do you establish, post, define, teach, and follow through on monitoring 3 to 5 positively stated classroom expectations. Before we work into that process of establishing and then teaching your positive class-wide expectations, let's look at a couple quick examples. At the elementary level, you might see in classrooms posters that identify students should be exhibiting safe behavior or kind behavior, or that they're ready to learn. You also might see in classrooms something called a behavioral matrix, which we'll be looking at through this part. In a behavioral matrix, you'll see that behaviors have been defined explicitly for each classroom routine. At the elementary level, you might see that teachers have identified how to clearly teach students in engaging lessons at the beginning of their year and throughout their year. The high school level is very similar. It actually mirrors many of the concepts we talk about at the elementary level for teaching social skills instruction and behavior expectations. You might see student-created posters on citizenship, on achievement, and on what grit looks like in a classroom. The high school level, typically a difference is that you might see high school teachers and teams engaging their students in the development of a classroom behavior matrix, as well as in the development and rollout of explicit social skills teaching lessons, either using videos, peer-to-peer interactions, engaging activities, or teacher-to-student dialogue. What does it not look like to have positively stated expectations in your classroom? And now think to yourself, do you see this around your school building? The first challenge or misconception at times of teachers is that you assume students will come into your classroom already knowing how to behave appropriately given your classroom parameters. Another misconception, and something you want to avoid, is having more than 5 expectations. The reason for that, it becomes challenging for any student, elementary up through high school, to remember more than 5 expectations. And then finally, you might walk into a classroom and see a rote list of behaviors the educator or the teacher does not want to see from their students. Again, this is a challenge. The inherent challenge here is that if we tell students what we do not want them to do, they're very likely to exhibit that very behavior. So we want to avoid telling them what we do not want them to do and focus on what we would like them to do in our classroom. The main question we'll look to answer in this Part 3 is how do I post, define, and teach expectations? As you may imagine, this process has a pretty explicit step-by-step procedure. We're going to talk through each one of these. First, we'll look to establish and post expectations in our rooms. We'll then talk about how to overtly teach those expectations to your students, how over time you'll prompt for those appropriate behaviors in your classroom, how you'll monitor for success, and effectively evaluate through progress monitoring across your school year. You will establish your expectations across 3 broad steps. First, establishing your expectations, then identifying routines, thirdly, creating examples. And this is where our conversation will take us. So to begin this conversation, let's first differentiate between expectations and rules. Expectations are broadly stated. They apply to all people in all settings across their school day, and they describe the general ways people should behave in your classroom. To differentiate, rules describe specific behaviors. These rules may apply to a limited number of settings across routines of your day, and rules may clarify behaviors for specific settings. Another great way to differentiate between expectations and rules, expectations are very broad, rules perhaps are very narrow. So, how do you establish and post expectations? And how many should you have? First, in your classroom, we look to identify 3 to 5 expectations. We look to have those expectations positively stated. Here the idea is we're looking to tell students what you want them to do rather than what you do not want them to do in your classroom. You take a look at the pictures below. We know human nature is if we're told what not to do, we clearly then want to do what we're supposed to not be doing. So the focus here, the same logic will apply in your classroom. You look to identify positively what you would like students to do from an expectation standpoint. You also want to avoid loopholes. You do not want to give so many ideas to students around the behaviors you do not want to see, or give them so many positively stated expectations that there's no way for them to possibly remember them all. You want to make sure your expectations are broad enough to capture all discrete behaviors across your school day and routines. And you want to make sure, again, that students can understand and quickly recall those expectations when they're prompted to do so. That gets to the final point here. You want these expectations to be easy for your students to remember. If you have school-wide expectations in place in your environment, you also may look to align your expectations in your classroom to those school-wide expectations. Here are a few examples. Be prompt, be prepared, be positive, be productive, be polite. Another example. Excellence, respect, responsibility, identifying positively in a very concise way what it means to be excellent, respectful, and responsible. Here's an acronym of positively stated expectations. And one more for you to take a look at. What we'd like for you to do now is turn to your workbooks for Activity 3.3, which is a stop and jot. Here you're going to look to develop or refine the expectations you currently have in your classroom. So look to answer the questions, what are your classroom expectations? If you happen to be working in a school or classroom that has defined 3 to 5 positively stated expectations, what are they? Do your classroom expectations align with those school-wide expectations? If you are not in a current practicing PBIS school, what expectations might you use in your own classroom? Welcome back for Activity 3.3. This is the review. At this point, you may have had some time to look at school-wide expectations, align language, or develop your own classroom expectations. You might want to look back and double-check your expectations. Are they positively stated? Do you think they're easy enough for your students to remember? And are they mutually exclusive? In other words, are they broad enough to capture all behaviors across the typical school day without any overlap? You do not want one expectation to overlap with another. So are they mutually exclusive? The next step in this process is for you to actually operationalize or define your identified expectations within routines of your typical school day. To do that, step one will be to operationally define. That is, how do we observe and measure the expectation that you've identified across your school routines and within your classroom? One way to do this is we're going to look at what's called a class-wide behavioral matrix. This matrix should complement your school-wide matrix, if in fact you have one, but be specific to your classroom setting. And we'll look more at that in a moment. A matrix can be flexible across ages and time. So again, if you happen to be in a school where you have a school-wide PBIS matrix, you may want to reference that and use that as we work through this next activity and align your class-wide expectations and develop your class-wide behavioral matrix with that school-wide matrix, contextualizing for the age and the time that you're using it in your school year with your students. So here's an example of a class-wide behavior matrix. I want you to take away a few important elements from this example template. First, horizontally, you have your class-wide expectations. You effectively will write in your 3 to 5 positively stated expectations in this column. Across the top, you have your different classroom routines. So on this example, we have entering the classroom as one routine, seat work as another, small group activity, and finally leaving the classroom. Within each of these boxes, what you're going to look to do is identify positively stated behavior examples. You're going to look to ideally have 2 to 3 examples for each box of your activity. For example, within the category, the expectation of respect, during small group activities, you're looking for students to listen to others and use kind words. Those are 2 very discrete, and you could then operationalize what those look like in that activity and during that routine. Furthermore, within responsibility in small group activities, you're looking for students to stay on topic and actively participate. And finally, what does safety look like during small group activities? That students are using materials carefully and they're staying in their personal space. What you'll notice is vertically in small group activities, none of these behaviors across expectations overlap with one another. In other words, they are mutually exclusive. Here are going to be a couple quick examples of completed class-wide behavioral matrices for you to take a look at. Here again, key elements, you have your class-wide expectations vertically, followed by your routines horizontally, And within each box, I'll give you some time to read through the identified discrete behaviors. Notice they are all positively stated. Here's a second example. This one's a high school example. Another example. What you'll notice too, across these few examples we are providing, are the expectations potentially overlap with one another, and that's okay. The important part is for you to identify and individualize this for your classroom, identifying your classroom routines, and even more important is identifying discretely the expected positive behaviors within each of your routines. So this matrix becomes more and more individualized, contextualized, and catered to your environment because you're the one developing it. Another one for you to take a look at. If you like, you can pause the video at this time and really review this in depth. What we're going to have you do now is look to your workbooks for activity 3.4. This is a classroom application activity. We're going to look for you to develop a classroom matrix. First, brainstorm and share examples of behaviors for your classroom behavior matrix. You're going to look to have 2 to 3 positively stated behaviors that are discrete from one another within each box of the matrix. You will look to fill in the behavior expectations you identified in activity 3.4 in the left-hand column. Second, you're going to look to identify 5 to 7 classroom routines by writing them in the boxes on the top row of that matrix template. Third, and again, likely most importantly, you will enter your 2 to 3 positively stated examples of behavior within each box of that matrix that you're developing. Once you've drafted your class-wide behavior matrix based off the expectations that you've established and the routines that you've identified, look to review your matrix with a peer or coach using their rubric in your workbook. Welcome back. This is the activity 3.4 review. Now that your classroom matrix is developed, double check to be sure that you have 2 to 3 positively stated expectations for each box. Commonly what we'll see after we've drafted our behavioral matrix within the classroom is that perhaps we have some overlap between the boxes, so we want to avoid that. We also at times find that not all expectations and behaviors within the boxes are positively stated. So ensure that you have at least 2 to 3 and that they are in fact positively stated. We're going to use the matrix as a scope and sequence for how we're going to teach behavioral expectations in your class, and that's to come. Now as we continue our conversation around how to establish, post, teach, review, and monitor a small number of positively stated expectations, we'll quickly review this graphic. At this point, you've already worked through this first step, establishing and posting your expectations. Within this step, you have just worked through activities whereby you have established expectations, identified your routines in your class-wide behavioral matrix, and created positively stated examples. Now we're going to move to the second step of this process. We're going to look to explicitly teach students the expectations in your room. First, as an aside, and this should come as no surprise to you, we are all excellent teachers. So in the teaching process, when we're looking at academic teaching, you follow a pretty scripted process. This will be the same process you'll follow when establishing how to teach expectations in your classroom. You're going to first define simply the concept or construct for your students. Academically speaking, you would then likely model for your students what that concept looks like. You then would give practice in the setting for your students with that new concept. You effectively would monitor and acknowledge their appropriate progress through acquisition and mastery of that concept. And if students were not mastering the concept, you would adjust for efficiency over time so that learning would occur. As an example from an academic standpoint, if you said to your students, A plus B equals C, where C is the sum or total of A and B combined, you may then model for them. You might say, watch me use these manipulatives. You might provide to them counting blocks. You might say, if A equals 6, putting out 6 blocks for them, and B equals 2, sliding 2 blocks in front of them to look at, then C equals 8, putting 8 blocks for them to visualize the learning. You might then, in your lesson, progress the students practicing. You might say, work with your partner and determine the total or sum for these 3 examples, providing them 3 addition examples. You might monitor them over time. You might say in the way of feedback, I noticed that everyone got number 1 and number 3 correct. Number 2 was tricky because we had to regroup or combine our values in the ones place to make it 10, and so on and so forth. Effectively, you're taking in formatively how your students are performing, you're adjusting your instruction and giving contingent feedback to your students until they master that concept that you've introduced. You might then say in this potential lesson, work with another partner and do 3 more examples, again reinforcing the notion of this addition focus. For behavior, it's the same thing. So how do we teach social behavior? Let's look at the example of being cut in line. First, we're going to define that simply. We're going to provide some modeling for our students, practice in the setting, monitor their practice of being cut in line, what they would do, then adjust for efficiency. So if you're teaching a student what to do if they've been cut in line, you would maybe open up the conversation by saying, if someone cuts you in line, you should remain calm and think about the situation. You might model for your students. You would say, watch, this is how I would respond if someone cut me in line, demonstrating appropriate behavior, always aligning it back to your class-wide expectations. Then you might say, tell me how you would respond if someone cut you in line at the water fountain. How about if it was in line at the snack? Again, so here you're giving your students ample practice across a series of different settings and or routines with this scenario. You then will move forward in the process, monitoring, acknowledging the student's rate of learning. You might say to them, that was great. What would that look like if you were cut in line in the classroom? How about in the store? Effectively, you're looking to build students' repertoire and fluency with this discrete example and this discrete behavior. You're now looking for them to generalize that learning across settings. Adjusting across time, you might say, great job, you got it. Tomorrow, let's figure out what else you might do in these similar situations. Now let's take a look at rules in the context of routines. When you're looking to identify rules across the different routines of your school day, you're going to first want to focus on teaching your expectations directly and overtly. To do this, you're first going to define the rule in operational terms. In other words, you're going to tell students what the rule looks like within routines of your school day. Always look back to your class-wide matrix as a guide for this conversation and as you develop your lessons. You're going to want to make sure to provide students with examples and non-examples of what rule-following behavior looks like within that routine. Broadly stated, this is the part of the teaching that we are modeling for the students, this particular rule. Next, you're going to look to actively involve your students in the lesson. This might be a game, role play, or some other activity that will cognitively engage students in the learning that you are presenting to them. This is also a great step in the process for you to check for the students' understanding. Are all students understanding what this particular rule means for them in your classroom within this routine? Are some not quite getting it and you need to adjust your direct instruction? This is a good part of the lesson in learning where you are leading the learning for your students. From there, you'll look to provide additional opportunities for practice, rule-following behavior in the natural setting. Effectively here, you are testing the students' acquisition and application of the new knowledge around this rule that you've been focusing on. Effectively, you're looking to have a separate lesson plan developed for each box within your class-wide behavioral matrix. Across the course of your school year, your school weeks, you're going to look to effectively and efficiently deliver those behavioral rule lesson plans to your students, ensuring each box within your class-wide matrix has been taught and reviewed thoroughly with all learners. The graphic in front of you here is a nice representation of what we're looking for you to do when you're explicitly teaching social skills and rules within routines of your classroom. This example comes from Fisher and Fry from a 2006 publication. And the big idea here is that through your explicit instruction, you're looking to consciously, gradually release the learning responsibility upon your students. So up top, we have teacher responsibility. First, you're going to explicitly instruct through an I do it approach. Here, you're effectively modeling for your learners. Then you're going to work with your students through some guided instruction. Collectively, this is the we do it portion of your lesson where you're leading them through new learning. From there, you're now really gradually releasing and pushing the responsibility of learning onto the shoulders of your students who at this point have acquired the new knowledge. And you're looking for students to collaborate with one another. They can do it together. And then finally, once they've mastered that level of understanding, independent practice will be important. So what are we ultimately trying to do with our social skills lesson plans and with our overt instruction around our class-wide expectations? Eventually, what we're trying to do with consistent and repeated focus on teaching expectations, we're looking to progress students through the different phases of learning. So the first phase of learning, students are trying to acquire new skills, new learning, new expectations, because you're a new educator to them, and that's a new classroom for them as well. So we're looking to teach them initially to increase the accuracy of the new skill. Your expectations, your routines will be new to them, so by teaching them explicitly what you expect of them across your routines, we're hoping to initiate an initial baseline of understanding around that skill set. Once they've acquired this skill set of expectations, we're then looking to increase the student's fluency or their ability to provide appropriate responses across time. They're more automatic with their behavior expectations in your classroom. Beyond that, and this gets into how we hopefully have a plan and a schedule in place to revisit critical expectations across points in the year, we're looking for students to maintain that learning. So are they able to perform that skill or that behavior across time without you having to reteach that expectation? A lot of these pieces, the fluency aspect and the maintenance aspect, we'll come back to and discuss as we talk about the continuum of responses to encourage students' appropriate behavior. If they've acquired the initial skill through your initial lesson plans, we're then hoping that they become fluent with that skill across the year and they're able to maintain that skill across time. To do this, we'll be discussing how can you consistently respond to appropriate behaviors and reinforce those behaviors when we see them in context. Finally, we're looking for students to generalize these appropriate behaviors, these expectations, across different areas and classrooms and environments of their school day. We call this stimulus generalization or response adaptation. What this means is that students understand what it means to show pride in your classroom during peer-to-peer time. Can they also now generalize what it means to demonstrate pride when they're walking to lunch in the hallway? The hope is they'll take some critical skills from your lesson plans in the routine and in the context of your environment and now generalize them out into their other settings of the school day as well as into their everyday lives. So again, the focus here on teaching explicit instruction and explicit social skills lessons to our students is to initially give them access to what our expectations are in the classroom, to build them towards fluently manifesting those behaviors, maintain those behaviors over time, then hopefully, if we're successful, generalizing those expectations across areas of their everyday life. So let's move back into the process of establishing and now teaching our explicit expectations. We've already identified how to establish and post those expectations. We've worked through how to teach those expectations. We'll now move into how to prompt, monitor, and evaluate your success over time. Let's look at how to prompt. The leading question here becomes, what behavioral procedures are involved in teaching? You'll recall from our initial 2 modules, the ABCs of behavior, our antecedent, the stimulus that precedes the behavior, the observable, measurable act of the individual, and the consequence, the outcome, or the stimulus that immediately follows the behavior that we're focusing on. This will be critical to consider when we start looking into how can we add in additional antecedent-based strategies, again, one of the focus areas of this module, to encourage appropriate student behavior in our classroom. A lot of antecedent instruction and a lot of antecedent strategies has to do with using different types of prompts and applying different prompting procedures. To define what prompting is, look at the right side of your screen. Prompting is presenting an additional stimulus to increase the probability that the SD, or the discriminative stimulus, will occasion the desired response. In other words, what we're trying to do through the conscious decision-making process of determining what type of prompts will be most appropriate, we're looking to encourage students to exhibit appropriate behaviors before the class even begins. Therefore, we qualify these prompts as antecedent-based strategies. When identifying different types of prompts, we want to be able to look at the just right prompt. That means we're not overwhelming students with too many prompts delivered at a high frequency. We're not delivering prompts too little either. We need to find this nice balance between the type of prompt we're using as well as the intensity of the prompt and the frequency of the prompt by which we're delivering. Once we've identified a prompting schedule or our model by which we're going to use prompts to help encourage students' appropriate behavior, we're also going to want to be able to think through how we can fade these prompts over time. As students demonstrate success, as students work through the phases of learning that we just mentioned, they've acquired the skill. If they're now fluent with the skill and they're moving towards the maintenance phase of learning, we might be able to identify how and when we can fade our prompts as appropriate across the school year. In the approaching slides, we'll be talking about the different types of prompts you may consider. And a lot of these I'm sure you've already heard of. and use in your day-to-day teaching worlds. We have verbal prompts, visual prompts, gestural prompts, modeling, and physical guidance. And we'll look at a couple of these examples on the next slide. So first, visual prompts. These are prompts, as stated, that students can see as they enter into your classroom. So are expectations clearly posted? Are they easily understood? And are students referred to these prompts across lessons? Are they visual in nature? This type of prompting will be considered the least intrusive version that we can select from. Additionally, you might have gestural prompts. So here you see an educator demonstrating a hand-raising prompt, exhibiting to students that she expects them to raise their hand in order to provide a response. Those are called gestural prompts. Another type of prompt is called physical guidance. In physical guidance-based prompting, we are actually doing hand-over-hand manipulation with students to help them achieve the task or the behavior that we're working on with them. Another type of prompting is known as modeling. And as educators, you do this one every day, probably without even knowing it. In this scenario, in this example, the teacher is modeling appropriate hallway walking behavior. She's walking in front of her classroom with her hands behind her back, walking in a quiet manner. You'll see her students in 2 single file lines behind her following her lead. This type of modeling could be considered an antecedent-based strategy, as it is a prompt that encourages students appropriate hallway-based behaviors. A final type of prompt also used very regularly are verbal prompts. This is the teacher or the educator in the classroom reminding students verbally what they're expected to do given the scenario or the context of the routine. Takeaway idea here, big idea, is by considering the 5 different types of prompts that we have access to, which ones are going to be most effective for us in the context, when delivering the routine, when reinforcing the routine, and when really utilized as an antecedent strategy to set up appropriate behavior. We'll ask you now to look back to your workbooks for activity 3.5. This one is a stop and jot. Here you're going to be focusing on planning your prompts. First, describe how you prompt expected behavior throughout the classroom routines you identified on your class-wide matrix. Consider specifically what it will look like for one expectation within one routine. Once we've had a chance to do that, come on back for our 3.5 review. Welcome back. This is the activity 3.5 review. Remember, the goal of prompting is always to increase the likelihood the student engages in a particular behavior. Remember that whenever we use prompts, we want to consider the following. First, this is a professional judgment call on your part. Choose the just right prompt. As we saw, there are a variety of prompts for you to choose from. You want to make sure that your prompt is not too much or too little for the student, but just right to get the outcome that you're looking for. Once you've effectively implemented your prompting structure, you're going to want to look to ways for you to fade your prompts as quickly as possible. Over time, you do not want students to become reliant on your prompts. You do want them to become independent in their progression through your routines in your classroom structures. Okay, welcome back. At this point, you've likely just come back from an activity whereby you were looking into the types of prompts you currently use and will look to use in the future based off the behavior matrix you've already developed. At this point, we'll revisit the cycle of how to establish, post, teach, review, and monitor a small number of positively stated classroom expectations. At this point, we've identified how to establish and post expectations, how to develop a behavior matrix to help identify across different routines what those expectations look like. We've also talked through how to teach those expectations, and most recently, how to prompt those expectations across your school day. We'll now look briefly at how to monitor expectations as you observe students in and around your classroom. To do this, we look at an article from 1997 from Colvin, Sugai, Good, and Lee, where they talked about the idea of active supervision. Again, a notion and a concept you've likely heard before and something you likely already do. When we're looking at how to actively supervise students, what we're looking to do can be broken down into 3 discrete steps: moving around, looking around, and interacting with students. Are we constantly moving around our classroom, monitoring student progress, making sure that they're exhibiting the appropriate behaviors, acknowledging them for those appropriate behaviors, and or providing quick, efficient error corrections when inappropriate behaviors do arise? So are we moving around actively during our lessons and through our routines? Second, similarly, and following up on the moving around, are we looking around? Are we constantly scanning our learners in our learning environment across routines and across the day? And are we interacting with students, reinforcing appropriate behaviors and correcting errors as they arise? If we can combine these three, and again, they are fluid, they intertwine with one another, we will hopefully be able to prompt students towards expected behaviors and quickly and efficiently respond to behaviors as they occur in our lessons and across our school. At this point, we're going to look to have you turn back to your workbooks for activity 3.6. This is a stop and jot activity. Here we're going to look for you to plan your active supervision. First, look to describe how you will move, scan, and interact with students throughout the classroom routines you identified in your class-wide expectation matrix. Then, consider specifically what active supervision will look like for one expectation and one routine that you've selected. Welcome back. This is the Activity 3.6 review. Does your plan include moving, scanning, and interacting? Did you identify and discuss with colleagues what this might look like for you in your classroom? Are there times of the day or specific instructional routines that you will target for increasing your active supervision? You may want to reflect on this particular question, as for many educators, there are specific routines that they want to identify and prioritize first as they start working on their active supervision. You might also want to discuss with a colleague or your coach why you chose that particular time to focus on improving your active supervision. At this point, we are all but wrapping up the process of how to establish, teach, now monitor, and finally evaluate the expectations we've developed for our classroom. At this point, we'll look at the final step in this process on how to evaluate whether or not all your teaching has done the trick, has done what you intended it to do, which is clearly and explicitly teach students what you expect of them. So to do that, as a reminder, we've already reviewed in Module 3 how to identify targeted dimensions of target behaviors for students, how to monitor behavior outcomes of students and groups of students across your school year. More on this in Module 7. But for now, please revisit the thoughts and the key takeaways from Module 3. When we're looking to evaluate the effect of our direct instruction around behavior support in our classroom, we're looking to collect data that's going to be useful for us and reflect on these outcomes with colleagues, with co-teachers perhaps in your classroom, and certainly across time self-reflections on your own. Questions you'll want to answer, and these questions will certainly drive the type and the intensity of data collection tool you'll use in your classroom. First, you'll ask yourself, are rules being followed? I've identified 3 to 5 positively stated expectations. I've explicitly taught those expectations in lessons and across routines. I've established my behavioral matrix. Now, as I've done that, can I confidently say that those rules are being followed across time? And what type of data will I need to collect and gather in order to rationalize and support that? If there are errors present, you might ask yourself, who's making them? Where are the errors occurring, and or what kind of errors are being made? Answering each of these questions for yourself will be important as you consider your action plan moving forward on who perhaps needs or requires additional behavior support, how you may support the entire class with more explicit lesson plans, how you may revisit certain expectations across certain routines through booster lesson plans, or additional outcomes that might drive your future steps. What you'll want to do with the data you've collected is summarize the data. Look for patterns, work with peers and colleagues who also perhaps have these students, or work with your coach to identify how to most appropriately action plan for continued improvement. Again, the big takeaway, the big idea here is we are not just implementing behavior expectations, we're not just teaching those expectations, prompting for those expectations, and monitoring those. We're actually looking to also evaluate the implementation of those expectations, and if they're not working, what can we do to continue to improve it? Again, the idea is we're not looking in the beginning of the year just to establish and teach expectations, but across the school year as a fluid process, we're looking to continually monitor and improve our own practices. So finally, we're using the data to make decisions. So at this point, we've all but wrapped up this step of this process. We've established routines. We've identified how to explicitly teach those expectations across routines. We've identified antecedent strategies across different types of prompts we may use, as well as how to monitor the implementation and the manifestation of appropriate behaviors across time, and finally, how to evaluate our effectiveness in our classrooms. Again, each of these steps is captured within 3 broad steps: establishing expectations, identifying routines through the development of a behavior matrix, and creating examples of what the behavior looks like for your students. Effectively, if you have a nice lesson plan, you should be able to capture each of these areas within this step. So what elements do go into an effective social skills lesson plan? All of your lesson plans for social skills should certainly include a brief explanation of the expectation or routine that you're focusing on, a statement, i.e. an operational definition, of what it looks like to follow the expectation within the routine, including both positive and negative teaching examples. You're also going to want to identify how to demonstrate the expectation following behavior. In other words, how you're going to model for students what you expect them to do. This is your first opportunity in your lesson to identify how you're really going to hook students into the learning, how you're going to engage them in this lesson. Next, your lesson plan should certainly have activities that provide students with guided practice. How will you lead them through different activities and allow them to start taking ownership of their own learning? And then finally, providing opportunities for students to independently demonstrate expected behaviors in the natural context. In other words, how are you going to test that they've taken away what you intended for them to learn? Have they met the objectives of your lesson? For the last activity in this part of this module, activity 3.7, we have a classroom application for you to work through. This one's focusing on development of social skills lesson planning within your behavioral matrix. First, before you develop your own lesson plan, please review the linked lessons in your workbook. Following your review, reflect on the provided examples. What did you think? Could you see lessons like this helping in your classroom or your subject area? Why or why not? Upon your review and following that reflection, look to select one box from your class-wide matrix. Apply the content and draft a social skills lesson plan, which is also included in your workbook. Once you've drafted your social skills lesson plan, review your lesson plan with a peer or your coach using the attached rubric, then share your lesson plan with your peers on Husky CT. Activity 3.7 Review. Now that you've developed your very own social skills lesson plan aligned to your class-wide behavioral matrix, ask yourself, does your lesson plan include a clear model, lead, test, component structure? If you would like additional examples or guidance, further guidance on teaching social skills, please check out this resource from the IRIS Center. This resource is hyperlinked for you through this video.